The moment my brother-in-law grabbed my wrist across the dinner table, I felt something shift behind my eyes. Not anger, not fear, something quieter than both. My sister's engagement party. 30 people packed into my parents' house in Barrie, Ontario. And I already knew, before the night was over, that something was going to break. I need to back up. Growing up, I was never the daughter my parents knew what to do with. My younger sister Heather was the easy one. Soft-spoken, pretty in the way that made aunts sigh with approval. Engaged at 24 to a man named Callum who sold commercial real estate in Mississauga and wore the kind of watch that told you everything about him before he opened his mouth. My parents adored him, called him a real provider, called him steady. What they meant was, he made sense to them. I didn't. I'd left home at 18 for CFB Trenton, then moved through postings in Petawawa, Edmonton, and eventually Halifax. I worked in intelligence analysis, which, on paper, sounds like something. In reality, it meant that when anyone at a family gathering asked me what I did, I said, administrative work for the military, and watched their eyes glaze over. Which was fine. That was the job. The job was silence. My mother had been trying to get me to settle down since I was 22. Every phone call ended with some version of the same question wrapped in different paper. Are you seeing anyone? Have you thought about transferring somewhere closer to home? Your father and I aren't getting younger, you know. I loved her. I genuinely did. But I'd learned to hold the phone slightly away from my ear during those parts. I was 31 when Heather got engaged. I drove up from Halifax for the party, took 2 days off, which, for what I was doing at the time, was not a small thing, and arrived at my parents' front door with a bottle of Niagara ice wine and a smile I'd been practicing since the 401. Callum met me at the door before my mother did. That was the first thing I noticed. He had that energy some men have, the kind that needs to establish the room before you've even taken your coat off. Firm handshake, eye contact held a beat too long, smile that didn't quite reach. The mysterious sister, he said. Heather talks about you. Good things, I hope, I said. He tilted his head like the question amused him. Mostly. My mother appeared behind him, arms out, smelling like the Jean Natte she'd worn my entire life. I let myself disappear into that hug for a second. Then my father came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a dish towel and his face when he saw me. That was real. That was the thing that made the drive worth it. There she is, he said quietly, and squeezed my shoulder, and that was enough. The house filled up over the next hour. Aunts and uncles from my mother's side, neighbors, people from Heather's yoga studio, Callum's parents down from Sudbury. A mother who spoke mostly in anecdotes about her son's accomplishments, and a father who had the quiet, sunken look of a man who'd long ago stopped arguing. Callum's younger brother Theo was there too. Early 20s, also in real estate, had the same watch. He spent the first 40 minutes of the party explaining cryptocurrency to my uncle, who was nodding with the patience of a saint. I stayed close to my father. We found a corner near the bookshelf and talked about the Leafs and his woodshop project, and the drive up from Halifax. He asked about my work the way he always did. Carefully, without pushing, just leaving space in case I wanted to fill it. I didn't, not here. But I loved him for asking. It was around 9 when things shifted. My cousin's son, he's 8, his name is Finn, had been running around the party all evening doing what 8-year-olds do at adult parties when they're bored and overstimulated. At some point, he knocked into Callum's arm while Callum was holding a glass of scotch, barely a spill, the kind of thing you laugh off. I watched Callum's face in the moment after. He didn't laugh it off. He set his glass down on the side table and crouched to Finn's level. I was close enough to hear. He said in a voice that was controlled and quiet and therefore more threatening than any raised voice would have been, "What do you say when you bump into someone?" Finn, who is 8 and terrified of most adults, stared at him. "You say sorry," Callum said. "You say sorry and you mean it, or you go sit in the corner and stay there." Finn's mother, my cousin Renata, was across the room and hadn't seen. My mother had seen but was doing the thing she does where she looks away and hopes problems dissolve. I looked at my father. He'd seen. He was already setting down his drink. But I was closer. "Hey, Finn," I stepped in, kept my voice easy. "Come help me find the good snacks in the kitchen. I think there's still some of Grandma's squares left." Finn looked at me like I'd thrown him a rope. He came immediately. I put my hand briefly on his shoulder as we walked away. I didn't look back at Callum. I didn't need to. In the kitchen, I found the squares, made Finn a small plate, and my mother's friend's daughter kept him company while I stood at the counter and let the thing that had been building in my chest settle back down into something manageable. When I came back to the living room, Callum was talking to my father. I won't pretend I could hear everything, but I caught the shape of it. My father, to his credit, had said something, and Callum, to absolutely no one's surprise, was explaining himself. Something about kids needing to learn manners, something about nobody teaching them consequences anymore. My father listened without expression. Then Callum noticed me standing nearby. "Your daughter does that thing," he said to my father, "where she swoops in and rescues everyone from having to deal with reality." I smiled. "And what reality is that? That the kid should apologize." "Basic stuff." He picked up his scotch again. "But I get it. Military admin, right? You're used to managing paperwork, not people." There it was. It wasn't the first time I'd heard some version of that from him. At Christmas 2 years ago, there'd been a comment about government paychecks and people who'd never had to run anything. I'd let it go then. Heather had given me a look across the table that said please, and I'd let it go. I looked at Heather now. She was standing near the fireplace with her hand on her wine glass, watching me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, somewhere between please and something else, something that looked almost like waiting. "I don't actually do admin," I said. Callum raised an eyebrow. Heather said, "Heather knows what I tell people at parties." I kept my voice pleasant. "What I actually do is different." He looked at me the way men like him look at women like me. A scanning look, assessing, recalibrating, and then he decided something. I could see the decision happen. He'd decided I was posturing. He'd decided I was doing the thing people do when they want to seem more interesting than they are. "Sure," he said, and smiled. My father was quiet beside me, not uncomfortable, just waiting. The party went on. I helped my mother clear appetizer plates, talked to my aunt about her garden, listened to Theo finish his cryptocurrency lecture, and pivot to talking about interest rates. Normal family party noise, but Callum tracked me from across the room in a way I kept noticing. At 10:30, people started filtering out to the deck. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker. It was cold for September. This was Ontario, but people had coats and drinks, and nobody wanted to be the first to go home. Finn had fallen asleep on the guest room bed upstairs. The volume on the whole evening had dropped to something more manageable. I was on my way back inside from the deck when Callum stepped into the doorframe. Not enough to block me. Just enough to make me slow down. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Heather says you're gone for months at a time. Missed her birthday 2 years ago. Missed your parents' anniversary last year." He had the glass in one hand, the other in his pocket. "Casual. What's the point of that? Of a career where you can't even be present for the people who actually matter?" I looked at him for a moment. "Are you asking because you're genuinely curious," I said, "or because you've decided the answer already?" He smiled. "I'm asking because I'm about to marry into this family and I'd like to understand you." "No," I said. "You'd like to establish something." His expression shifted. Not angry, not yet, but the pleasantness went out of it. "You know what your problem is?" "I really don't think you want to start that sentence," I said. Still quiet. Still even. He started it. He said, "Your problem is you've spent so long being someone's soldier that you forgot how to be a person." He gestured vaguely, at me, at the house, at some idea of me. "You show up twice a year, insert yourself into situations that don't need you, and then disappear again. And everyone just accepts it because, what? Because you wear a uniform?" The deck had gone quiet. People were listening. I could feel it. I'm gonna tell you what I felt in that moment, because this is the part I've thought about a lot since. I didn't feel humiliated. I didn't feel the hot, rising thing that I think he was hoping for. What I felt was something very close to calm. The kind of calm I'd learned to find in situations where getting it wrong had costs he would genuinely not be able to imagine. And underneath that calm, something much older. The specific exhaustion of being misread by people who have only ever bothered to look at the surface. I said, "Tell me something, Callum. How many people in this house right now would you say have a real sense of what I do when I'm not here?" He shrugged. "That's my point. My dad does," I said. "Not the details, but the shape of it. He's always known the shape of it." I paused. "You've been in this family for 2 years and you've already decided who everyone is. That's fast work. I just call it like I see it." "You call it like you've decided to see it. That's different." He set his glass down on the railing. Deliberate. I noted it. "You want to have this conversation?" he said. "Fine, let's have it. What exactly do you do that's so important you can't make your sister's birthday?" "I can't tell you that." He laughed. Not a nice laugh. "Right, I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying that literally. There are things I'm not legally able to share." Convenient. I looked at him. He was at that place where alcohol and ego meet. Not sloppy, but loose in a way that had made him forget that he didn't actually know me. That was the mistake. He'd been calibrating me all night as the kind of woman who could be talked over. He'd built a whole model of me in his head, and he was very committed to it. He stepped forward. Not menacing. He was too controlled for that, but into my space in a way that was meant to be territorial. "I'm going to be your brother-in-law," he said. "I think you should think carefully about what kind of relationship you want to have." "I agree," I said. "I've been thinking about it all night. And I think the kind of relationship I want is one where you don't grab my wrist." He looked down. His hand was on my wrist. I'd felt it happen, that sliding in motion where someone wants to make a point and reaches without thinking. He hadn't even realized he'd done it. He started to say something, and then I moved. I want to be careful here about how I describe this, because I'm aware of how these things sound when you write them out. I'm not describing it to impress anyone. I'm describing it because it happened and because I think about it differently now than I did that night. The wrist grab gave me the mechanics I needed. I used his own grip against him, a rotation, a step to the inside, controlled pressure on the joint. It took maybe 3 seconds. He went from standing to having his cheek against the deck railing with his arm behind his back. Not slammed. Not thrown. Just placed. With exactly the amount of force required and none more. The deck was silent. Callum made a sound. Not quite pain, more like shock. The sound of a body that has been moved without its permission. I held the position for exactly long enough. Then I released him, stepped back, and straightened my jacket. "I'm not angry," I said. "I want you to understand that, but you are not going to touch me." He turned around. His face had gone through several things and landed on something pale and recalculating. My mother was in the doorway to the kitchen. She had her hand over her mouth. Heather was standing perfectly still near the speaker, her wineglass hanging from her fingers. It was my father's voice that came first, from somewhere near the back of the deck. "Renat Nut," he said to my cousin, calm as anything. "Could you take Finn's leftovers upstairs? I think he might wake up hungry." It was the most dad thing I have ever heard. It didn't fix anything. It just restored some oxygen to the room. My mother found her voice approximately 8 seconds later. "Iris," she said, because that's my name, Iris, and she only uses it like that when she's either very proud or very alarmed. "What on earth?" He grabbed my wrist, I said. "You could have said something. I did say something. You didn't have to." She stopped, looked at Callum, looked at me. The math on her face was complicated. I understood it. I had been doing complicated math all night too. Heather hadn't moved. Callum straightened up, fist his collar. He had enough self-possession left to not make it worse, which I'll credit him. He picked up his scotch, he said, quietly. "That was out of line, on both sides." "On both sides," I repeated. "You know what I mean. I know exactly what you mean." My father walked across the deck and stood beside me. He didn't say anything, he just stood there. And something about that, the simple, uncomplicated fact of him being next to me, was the thing that finally made my throat close. The party ended within 20 minutes. People found coats, made excuses, said goodnight. Callum's parents left first. Theo left without finishing his drink. My cousin Renata squeezed my arm on the way out and didn't say anything, and I was grateful for that. When the house was mostly empty, I helped my mother with the glasses. We didn't talk. She handed me things and I carried them to the kitchen, and we moved around each other in the particular silence of women who love each other and are not ready to discuss what just happened. My father made tea. The three of us sat at the kitchen table. After a while, he said, "I've been watching that man for 2 years." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "He's not bad," my dad said. "I want to be fair. But he's the kind of person who needs to know where everyone stands. And you never gave him that. You never let him place you. That bothered him." "He bothered Finn," I said. "Yes." My father nodded. "He did." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a voice I hadn't heard from her in a long time, "I should have said something. When he crouched down at Finn, I saw it. I should have said something." I looked at her. "You always say, 'I don't see you,'" she said. She was looking at the table. "I do see you. I just sometimes don't know how to say what I see." We sat with that for a while. Eventually, she looked up and said, "Where did you learn to do that? The wrist thing." I looked at my father. He looked back at me with just the faintest trace of something that on another man might have been a smile. "Work," I said. Heather called me 2 days later, when I was already back in Halifax. It was a long conversation, not an easy one. She wasn't angry exactly, but she was shaken. By the evening, by Callum, maybe by the fact that she'd watched it happen and stood still. I didn't push her. She needed to find her own footing with what she'd seen. What she said near the end of the call was, "I just didn't know you could do that." And I said, "I know you didn't." There was a pause. "I think maybe I should have asked more questions," she said. "There's still time," I said. Callum called Renata the next day and apologized for the Finn incident. Not to me, to Renata. It was something. My mother told me about it in a text, just one line. "He called Renata. Thought you should know." I sat with that for a minute. Then I wrote back, "Good. Thank you for telling me. What I've thought about the most since that night is not the deck. It's not the 3 seconds against the railing. It's the kitchen table. My parents and me, and the tea going cold, and my mother saying 'I do see you' in a voice that had been practicing that sentence for 31 years and was only now getting it out. My father called me a week later, a Tuesday night, just to talk. We talked for an hour and a half about nothing in particular. His wood shop, the weather in Barrie. Whether the Leafs would actually do anything this year. Before he hung up, he said, "You know what I always told your mother when she worried about you?" I said I didn't. I said, "That one's going to be fine. That one has always known exactly where the floor is." I didn't say anything for a second. "Get some sleep," he said. "Don't work too hard." I told him I wouldn't. I told him I loved him. I drove to work the next morning in the Halifax fog, badge on my hip, coffee in hand, thinking about the floor. About how long it takes some people to find it. About how some people spend their whole lives mistaking someone else's silence for an absence of depth. Don't make that mistake. The quiet ones always know exactly where the floor is. I keep coming back to the railing, not the 3 seconds. Those were muscle memory, reflex, training, doing what training does. What I keep coming back to is the moment after. The deck gone quiet. My mother's hand over her mouth. And my father, somewhere at the back, asking Renata about Finn's leftovers in the calmest voice I have ever heard. He didn't make a scene. He didn't step forward and announce himself. He just restored oxygen to the room. That's who he is. That's who he has always been. Someone who understood that real steadiness doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. I think about Callum too, and I try to be honest when I do. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had spent his whole life in rooms where confidence and volume were the same thing. where knowing your worth meant making sure other people knew it first. That world rewards a certain kind of person, and he had learned to be that person very well. What he hadn't learned, what nobody in that world had ever asked him to learn, was how to read a room where those rules didn't apply. That's a failure of intelligence, not cleverness, not credentials. I mean the quieter kind. The kind that asks, what don't I know about this person yet? The kind that understands that silence is information, not absence. He saw me and decided he already knew the shape of me. He never questioned a decision once all evening. And that cost him. There's a version of that night where I lose, where I let the humiliation land, where I go small under it, where I apologize for taking up space in a room I'd driven 8 hours to be in. I've been that version of myself before. Most of us have. We shrink because it feels safer, because it costs less in the moment, because the people around us are more comfortable when we do. But there's a price for that kind of safety. You pay it slowly, in increments, over years. You pay it every time someone grabs your wrist and you decide it's not worth the trouble. You pay it until one day you realize you've spent so long making yourself easy to manage that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be. What I know now, what that night gave me if it gave me anything, is that integrity isn't the absence of conflict. It's being the same person in the hard moment that you are in the quiet ones. It's not performing calm. It's having enough of a foundation inside yourself that the noise outside doesn't move you. My father built that in me without ever naming it. Not through lectures, through 30 years of showing up, staying even and knowing exactly where the floor was so that I could find it too. Finn is 8 years old. He reached for my hand at that party because some adult had crouched down in front of him and used a controlled voice to make him feel small. I want him to grow up knowing the difference between authority and intimidation. I want him to know that the people worth trusting are the ones who don't need to make you feel small to feel large themselves. That's worth a drive from Halifax. That's worth every awkward holiday dinner to come. The quiet ones always know where the floor is. Don't mistake their silence for anything other than what it is.